The most feared man in Chicago knelt on a blood-soaked floor, not before an enemy, not before a rival, but before a woman he paid to clean his house. And in that single moment, something inside the monster cracked open that would never fully close again. What happens when the most dangerous man in the city falls for the one woman capable of destroying everything he built? Stay until the end. You will not see the final blow coming. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since noon and showed no intention of stopping. Rhett Vallon stood at the window of his 43rd floor office and watched the city dissolve into gray. Chicago looked different in the rain, smaller somehow, like a fist unclenching. The lights on Michigan Avenue bled into long amber streaks down the wet glass. Below, people moved fast with their heads down, collars up, like they were trying to disappear. He understood that instinct better than most. His phone had rung 11 times in the last hour. He hadn't answered once. The voice on the intercom crackled. "Mr. Vallon, your 3 o'clock is still waiting in the... Send them home." "Sir, this is the Castellano account. They flew in from..." "I said send them home, Marcus." A pause. Then, "Yes, sir." He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and breathed through it. The Castellano account was worth $4 million a year in laundered construction contracts. He didn't care. He couldn't make himself care, which was a problem he hadn't figured out how to name yet. It was 3:17 in the afternoon, and Isla Voss had not come to work. That had never happened before. Not once in 3 years. Rhett was not a man who noticed the presence of people around him. He moved through rooms and other people adjusted. He spoke and other people listened. He had cultivated this quality deliberately over years, because in his world, invisibility was a weapon and attention was a liability. But he had noticed Isla, not in the way he noticed beautiful women, and she was, though she dressed in a way that seemed designed to make you forget it, but in the way you notice a system running smoothly. You only become aware of it when it stops. She arrived every morning at 7. He knew this because the coffee was always ready by the time he came down at 7:15, and it was always the right temperature, and there was always a folded newspaper on the kitchen counter, even though he had never asked for one and had never mentioned that he read them. She left every evening at 5. The house ran differently after she left. Not badly, the other staff were competent enough, but differently. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with noise. He'd had housekeepers before. Good ones. He'd never thought about any of them between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. He thought about Isla, not in ways he was proud of. He turned from the window. His office was all dark wood and reinforced glass, books he'd read and books he displayed for different reasons, a desk that had cost more than most people's cars. Framed on the wall behind him was a map of Chicago divided into territories, annotated in red. It looked like a wound. He called Marcus back. "Pull Isla Voss's home address from HR. Don't ask why." "Already pulled it, sir. I anticipated, but..." "You anticipated. You've checked your phone 4 times in the last 20 minutes, sir. I thought it might be relevant." Rhett looked at his phone on the desk. He hadn't been aware he was doing that. "Text it to me," he said, "and cancel everything for the rest of the day." "Everything?" "Everything." He was already reaching for his coat. He called. The address was a walk-up in Pilsen. 3 stories of red brick that had been old when the neighborhood was still working class and hadn't improved with time. The kind of building where the buzzers on the front panel were either broken or relabeled so many times you couldn't trust any of them. The rain had turned the front steps dark and slick. A grocery bag, abandoned on the stoop, had gone translucent from the wet. Rhett stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He'd come alone, which his security detail had not been happy about. He didn't care. There were situations that required force and situations that required quiet. He'd been doing this long enough to know the difference. He pressed the buzzer for 2B. Nothing. He pressed it again and held it for 3 seconds. Nothing. The front door was a standard residential lock, the kind that looked more secure than it was. He slid a card from his inner pocket, not a credit card, worked the latch with practiced efficiency, and pushed inside. The lobby smelled like old carpet and cigarettes and someone's dinner from 3 floors up. A row of metal mailboxes lined one wall, some with names taped on them, some blank. He took the stairs. 2nd floor. The hallway light was working, but barely. one of those energy-saving bulbs that hadn't fully warmed up and cast everything in a jaundiced yellow. 2B was at the end of the hall. He raised his hand to knock and stopped. The door was open, not wide open, just a crack, maybe 2 inches, the latch not seated. But in Rhett's world, a door that should be closed and wasn't was never a neutral observation. His hand went to the inside of his jacket. The weight of the weapon there was familiar, reassuring in a functional way, the same way a surgeon finds comfort in knowing the instruments are present before the incision. He pushed the door open with 2 fingers and stepped inside. The apartment looked like something had detonated in the middle of it. A side table was on its back. The lamp beside it shattered, the bulb gone dark. A bookshelf had been pulled from the wall, books scattered in a wide fan across the floor. The kitchen was visible from the doorway. A chair overturned, a mug broken, coffee dried in a splatter pattern up the cabinet face that told him it had been thrown some hours ago. A framed photograph of 2 women in summer dresses lay face up on the floor, glass cracked across it. There was a smell in the room he recognized and hated, iron and copper and something underneath that, something biological, that he associated with moments he didn't let himself revisit. Blood. It wasn't on the floor, not the main space. His eyes moved in a systematic sweep, left to right, high to low, cataloging and eliminating. Then he heard it. A sound from the hallway beyond the kitchen, small and wet, a breathing sound. He moved through the kitchen fast, stepping over the broken mug, and pushed open the door at the far end. The bedroom. Isla was on the floor beside the bed, wedged into the gap between the bed frame and the nightstand, as if she'd crawled there and run out of the energy to go further. She was in the clothes she would have worn to work that morning. Dark slacks, a gray blouse, 1 shoe still on, 1 shoe missing. Her face was turned away from him, but he could see the line of her shoulder and the way her chest was moving. Shallow, too shallow, with a catch on every inhale. He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside her. Isla. She flinched at her name. The flinch moved through her whole body, and it told him she was conscious, which was something, and it also told him she was terrified, which did something to his chest he wasn't prepared for. It's me. He kept his voice low and even. It's Rhett. You're okay. I'm not going to hurt you. A pause, then she turned her head. He'd prepared himself, in the 2 seconds between speaking and her moving, for something bad. He had not prepared himself for this. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut, the skin around it a color that moved from deep purple at the socket to sick yellow at the edges, which meant it hadn't happened in the last hour. Her lower lip was split and had bled down her chin, dried now to a rust-brown line. There was a mark on her jaw that had the precise shape of a knuckle, and another on her throat. And when his gaze moved down, he saw that the sleeve of her blouse had been torn at the shoulder seam. He'd seen violence his whole adult life. He'd participated in it. He'd ordered it. He'd watched men he'd put in rooms not walk out again and felt nothing beyond the cold assessment of whether the outcome was correct. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs and made them stop. "Can you move?" he said. Her voice, when it came, was a ruin. Something had been done to her throat, not a bruise. Something worse, something that had changed the quality of her voice and probably hurt to use. "How did you didn't come to work? Can you move?" She tried to push herself up. The sound she made stopped him from letting her continue. He got his arm under her back and his other arm behind her knees and lifted her, slowly, the way you'd lift something you were afraid of breaking further. She was lighter than he expected. She was also shaking, fine tremors running through her like current, and he recognized that kind too, the body in the aftermath of adrenaline burning through what was left. "I'm fine," she said. It was one of the most dishonest things he'd ever heard. "No," he said, "you're not." He sat her carefully on the edge of the bed and crouched in front of her, and for a moment he just looked. Not at the damage, though he was cataloging that too, clinical and cold, storing it, but at her. The way she was trying to hold herself together. The way her one remaining shoe was pressed flat against the floor, as if having something solid underfoot was the only thing keeping her anchored. The way she wasn't crying, which told him she'd already done that, somewhere in the hours before he arrived. "Who did this to you?" he said. She looked away. "Isla." "It doesn't matter." The temperature in the room dropped 2 degrees. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "Tell me who did this to you." She made a sound that might have been a laugh in another universe. You're going to do something terrible to him. Yes. That's why I'm not telling you. He studied her face. What he saw there was not fear of him exactly. It was something more complicated, a woman who had spent time thinking about the exact consequences of this conversation and had made a calculated decision about what to withhold. His name, Rhett said, or I spend the next 6 hours finding it myself. Your choice which method we use. She was quiet for a long time. The rain hammered the window. Somewhere in the building, a television played through the wall. Kane, she finally said. Tyler Kane, we were together for 8 months. It ended 3 weeks ago. He didn't... She stopped, started again. He didn't take it well. Rhett stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the alley below, which was full of rain and garbage and the absolute absence of Tyler Kane. He was running through what he knew about his own reaction, trying to understand it, because understanding it was the only way to control it. And control was the only thing standing between him and doing something that would not serve Isla at all. He had never experienced anything like the specific quality of rage currently moving through his body. He turned around. You're coming with me. She blinked. What? You're not staying here. He picked up the torn sleeve of her blouse between 2 fingers and dropped it. You can't stay here. I have a neighbor. You're coming with me, he said again. Not a request, not precisely an order, something in between, the kind of statement that acknowledged she had a choice and simultaneously made clear what he thought of the alternatives. My estate has a medical staff. You need to be examined. After that, you can make whatever decisions you want. She looked at him for a long time. He held the look. He was very good at holding looks. It was a tool he'd developed young and never stopped using. But this one cost him something he couldn't quantify. I don't want your charity, she said. It isn't charity. You work for me. You're injured. This is logistics. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Her lip was too damaged for that. But the suggestion of one, brief and tired. Logistics, she repeated. Logistics, he said. Get whatever you need. We're leaving in 5 minutes. The drive to the estate took 40 minutes in the rain. Rhett sat in the back with her, which he almost never did. Usually the back seat was for phone calls, for the focused silence of someone who had learned to treat transit time as productive time. Tonight he sat without his phone and watched the city slide past the tinted windows and tried to understand what was happening in his own chest. Isla sat against the opposite door, her knees drawn up slightly, her arms crossed over her body. She was wearing a coat he'd found in her closet. He'd had to help her into it, which she'd hated, which he'd respected. And she was watching the city the same way he was, not quite seeing it. He had 3 medical staff on retainer at the estate. He had a suite on the 2nd floor that had never been used by anyone. He had a security system that made military compounds look casual. She would be safe there. That was the only thought he was allowing himself. Safe, safe, safe. Because the alternative thoughts, the ones circling the edge of his mind like something hungry, were not useful and were not going to help her. He's done this before, Rhett said. Not a question. A pause. Once, 2 months ago. I left after that. He found me anyway. The driver, a man named Colt, who had been with Rhett for 9 years, showed no reaction at all to this conversation. Colt had heard worse. Rhett paid him specifically because of his capacity for strategic deafness. You didn't tell anyone, Rhett said. I told people. You didn't tell me. She turned her head and looked at him directly for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. Her damaged eye caught the passing streetlights and turned them amber. You're my employer, Mr. Vallon, not my... She stopped, choosing a word. Not my person. He looked back at her. I am now, he said. She turned back to the window. Neither of them said anything else for the rest of the drive. The estate occupied 2 acres in Lincoln Park, surrounded by a wall that didn't look like a security installation and absolutely was one. The gate opened as the car approached and closed behind them with a weight and finality that Isla seemed to notice. He saw her shoulders change slightly, the set of them, a recalibration. He'd bought this place 8 years ago for strategic reasons. It was defensible, It was impressive. It projected the right kind of power to people who visited for the right kind of reasons and the wrong kind of power to people who came uninvited. He had 17 rooms he'd never slept in. He had a kitchen that could feed 50 people, and he usually ate alone. He had never thought about any of that until the moment Isla Voss walked through his front door, cradled in his arms with blood dried on her lip, and a broken expression she was working very hard not to show. Dr. Rena Walsh was already waiting in the front hall. Marcus had called ahead. A compact woman in her 50s who had the practiced calm of someone who had treated a great many things that required practiced calm. She looked at Isla and then looked at Rhett and said nothing except, "Let's get you upstairs." Rhett carried Isla to the second-floor suite. She protested once, quietly, and he ignored it, and she seemed to decide that the amount of energy required to fight about it was more than she had available. The suite had a sitting room, a bedroom, a bathroom with a walk-in shower and a tub, and a view of the garden that was currently invisible under the rain. He set her on the edge of the bed and straightened up. "I'll leave you with Dr. Walsh," he said. "She'll examine you, tell me what you need, and you'll have anything you ask for." Isla was looking at the room. He watched her look at it, the high ceiling, the clean lines, the absolute absence of chaos. She had spent some portion of today wedged between a bed and a nightstand, bleeding, and now she was here. He wondered what that felt like. He found he very much wanted to know. "Rhett," she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He wasn't sure she'd noticed. "Thank you." He nodded once and left the room. Patem. In the hallway outside, he stood with his back against the wall for 60 seconds and breathed. Then he took out his phone and called a man named Garrett, who ran his intelligence operation and who could find anything Rhett needed found. And he said, "Tyler Kane, Chicago. I need everything. Address, workplace, vehicles, schedule, known associates. I need it in 2 hours." "Is this a conversation piece or a decision?" Garrett asked. This was how Garrett always asked whether the subject of the search was to be located or to be removed. Rhett thought about Isla's face. He thought about the knuckle print on her jaw and the torn sleeve and the sound she'd made when she tried to get up from the floor. "I haven't decided yet," he said. "Get me the information first." He hung up and pushed it off the wall and walked downstairs, where 3 of his lieutenants were waiting for him in the study with faces arranged in the careful, neutral expressions of men who had learned that showing curiosity in his presence was not a career advancement strategy. He sat down at the head of the table and told them to give him the rundown on the evening's operational matters. And he listened, and he responded, and his voice was level and his hands were still, and the part of his brain that ran the organization functioned exactly as it always had. The other part of his brain was somewhere upstairs, behind a closed door, sitting at the edge of a bed. 2 hours later, Garrett delivered. Tyler Kane, 31, commercial electrician, lived in a rental house in Bridgeport, drove a blue Silverado with a cracked rear light, frequented a bar called McNally's on Archer Avenue most evenings between 9 and midnight. 2 prior domestic disturbance calls on his record, both closed without charges, which told Rhett exactly what it told him about the willingness of the system to do anything useful about men like Kane. No known criminal affiliations, no connections to any organization Rhett needed to worry about. A private citizen, an ordinary man who hit women. Rhett folded the sheet of paper in half and put it in his inside pocket. He was not going to make a decision about Kane tonight. He was going to make a decision about Kane when his thinking was cleaner, when the specific quality of fury currently running through his system had metabolized into something colder and more useful. He had learned, early and at significant personal cost, that decisions made in the hot center of emotion were decisions you spent years managing the consequences of. Tonight, he would wait. He went back upstairs. Dr. Walsh met him in the hallway outside the suite, her medical bag over one shoulder, her expression the same composed neutrality it always was. 3 cracked ribs, she said. Nothing displaced, but she'll need to be careful about breathing for the next few weeks. The eye socket is intact. It looks worse than it is. The lacerations are superficial. She has bruising across her upper arms and shoulders consistent with being grabbed and thrown. The throat is going to be sore for several days, but there's no structural damage. She paused. She's been injured before. There's older bruising, some scarring on the forearm. He absorbed this without expression. What does she need? Rest, pain management, clean nutrition, and... Walsh paused again, with the slight hesitation of someone choosing their words. She should talk to someone, a professional, in time. I'll arrange it. She's asking for her phone. Give it to her. She's also asking. Walsh's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. She's asking if she can have a cup of tea. Something inside his chest did something it had absolutely no business doing. Tell her she can have whatever she wants, he said. He waited until Walsh had left, and then he stood outside the closed door for a moment. Behind it, there was a woman who had been brought here damaged and furious and trying not to show it, who had worked in his house for 3 years and learned to leave a newspaper out without being asked, who had looked at him with dark eyes and said, "You're my employer, not my person," and who was currently in a room in his house asking for a cup of tea. He raised his hand and knocked twice. "Come in," she said. He pushed the door open and stood in the doorway. She was sitting up in the bed now, the pillows arranged behind her, the bedside lamp throwing a warm circle of light that made the damage to her face look somehow less brutal and more human. She'd changed into something from the bag she'd brought, a loose shirt, her hair down for the first time since he could remember. Without the professional severity of how she usually wore it, she looked different, younger, or maybe just less defended. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read, which was unusual. He could generally read expressions. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Like I got hit by a wall," she said. "That's probably accurate." A pause. He didn't move from the doorway. He was aware, with a precision that surprised him, of the distance between where he was standing and where she was sitting, and of the fact that the distance was appropriate and that he intended to maintain it. "You're going to look for him," she said. "Tyler. I have information about him, yes." "What are you going to do with it?" He looked at her directly. "I don't know yet." She held his gaze. She was one of the very few people who could hold his gaze without blinking first, and he had noticed this before, in other contexts, and filed it under interesting without knowing what to do with the file. "Don't kill him," she said. "I haven't decided anything." "I'm asking you," she said, "not as your housekeeper, as me. I'm asking you not to kill him." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because I don't want to be responsible for a man's death, even that man's death." He looked at her for a long time. The rain moved against the window. Somewhere downstairs, the house hummed with the quiet activity of people who worked for him, who moved carefully around the edges of whatever was happening on the second floor. "All right," he said. She let out a breath, slowly, carefully, with the ribs. "Get some sleep," he said. He pulled the door closed and stood in the hallway, and the feeling in his chest was still there. That same feeling from the floor of her apartment, the same feeling that had made his hands shake. He stood with it for a moment, examined it. He was a man who valued self-knowledge because self-knowledge was operational. You couldn't predict your own behavior if you didn't know what was driving it. He knew what this was. The knowing didn't make it simpler. The next morning came gray and cold. The rain finally finished, but leaving the city raw. Rhett was up at 5, the way he always was, and he spent an hour in the gym on the basement level running himself into a state of functional clarity, which was the only form of peace he'd ever been able to manufacture. By 6:30, he was showered, dressed, at his desk, moving through the first reports of the day. At 7:15, he went to the kitchen. Isla was already there. She was standing at the counter in the same loose clothes she'd slept in, her hair up now, moving with careful deliberation. He could see the ribs in every movement, the small adjustments she was making to protect them. She had found the coffee and was standing with a mug pressed between both hands, looking out the kitchen window at the garden, which was wet and silver in the early light. He stopped in the doorway. She heard him anyway. She always heard him. He didn't know how. And turned. "You shouldn't be up," he said. "I slept 12 hours, she said. "I'm up." He came into the kitchen and poured his own coffee. She watched him do it, which was a reversal they were both aware of. "You usually have it waiting," he said. "You usually don't have me in a guest suite with 3 cracked ribs," she said. "Fair." They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen island and drank coffee. The morning light shifted. A cardinal appeared on the garden wall and disappeared. He noticed that she noticed the cardinal, the way her eyes tracked it with something complicated. Not just pleasure. Something underneath that, some private accounting she was doing about the fact that she was here, in this house, with coffee, watching birds, and not where she had been yesterday. "I need to go back to my apartment," she said. "My things, I'll send someone." "My things are my things," she said. "I packed them myself." "You have 3 cracked ribs." "I'm aware of my ribs." He looked at her over the rim of his coffee mug. "I'll send someone with you. You give the instructions. They carry." She considered this. He could see her running the cost-benefit the same way she always ran things. Quietly, efficiently, arriving at conclusions other people took twice as long to reach. "Fine," she said. "And you're staying here," he said, "until the situation with Kane is resolved." "What situation? You agreed not to kill him," Rhett said. "I didn't agree not to do anything. He'll know he's being watched. Men like that, when they know someone is watching, they become cautious. You'll be safer here in the meantime." She was quiet for a moment, which was not agreement but was not a fight either. "I have work to do," she said. "My work." "Not this week." "Rhett. Isla." He set his coffee down on the counter. "You have 3 cracked ribs and a face that looks like a car accident and a man who has hurt you twice who doesn't know where you are. You're going to rest for a week. Then we'll discuss it." She looked at him with an expression that moved through about 4 different things in quick succession. Frustration. A flash of something that might have been gratitude. Then something more settled, more guarded, that he recognized as the expression of someone deciding how much trust they could afford. "A week," she said. "A week." She picked up her coffee and went back to looking at the garden. He picked up his and did the same. They stood there 6 feet apart, not talking, and the morning moved around them. It was, he thought, the most comfortable silence he had experienced in a very long time. By afternoon, the comfort had acquired a complication. Damon Cross arrived at the estate at 2 o'clock for their standing Tuesday meeting, which covered operational updates, financial reviews, and the dozen small strategic decisions that kept the organization running. Damon was 38, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been broken and reset enough times that it had an interesting quality. Not handsome exactly, but compelling, the kind of face you kept looking at to figure it out. He'd been with Rhett for 11 years. He was the only person Rhett would call, without qualification, a friend. The only person Rhett had told things to that he hadn't told anyone else. The only person, besides Marcus, who would tell him when he was wrong. He came into the study, shook the rain off his jacket, dropped into the chair across from Rhett's desk, and said, "I heard you brought someone home." "Word travels," Rhett said. 17-room estate, 1 new occupant. "Yeah, word travels." Damon looked at him. "She okay?" 3 cracked ribs, soft tissue damage. She'll be fine." Damon was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that contained more information than most people's words. Rhett had learned to read it over 11 years, the same way you learn to read weather. This particular quiet had weight to it. "She works for you," Damon said. "She does." "You don't usually—" "I know what I usually do," Rhett said. The edge in his voice was slight, just enough. Damon heard it and redirected. "What are you doing about the guy?" "Watching." Damon nodded. He knew what watching meant in this context. It meant Kane had acquired a shadow, would acquire a shadow, would find that certain things that had been open to him were now more difficult. Not violence. Pressure. The kind of pressure that didn't leave marks but shaped behavior. "What do you need from me?" Damon asked. "Nothing on this. I handled it." Another wait in the silence. Then Damon looked down at the file on the desk between them and said, "Right, so, the Brixton territory. We've got a problem." They spent the next 2 hours on business. It was good business, clean, focused, productive. And at some point in the middle of it, Rhett became aware that Damon's attention was not entirely on the files. It was moving, occasionally toward the ceiling, toward the floor above them, which was where the guest suite was, which was where Isla was. He filed this away. He didn't examine it yet. After Damon left, Rhett sat at his desk for a while in the gray afternoon light, thinking about the configuration of forces in his house, and in his city, and in his own chest, and how they were beginning to intersect in ways that were going to require very careful navigation. He was still thinking about it when his phone rang with a number he hadn't expected and hadn't heard in a long time. He looked at the number for a moment, then the name below it registered. He felt something move through him that was not anger and not fear, but occupied the same space as both. Victor Draven. Victor Draven, who ran the largest rival organization in the Midwest. Victor Draven, who had been trying to take pieces of Rhett's territory for 3 years. Victor Draven, who had never once called him directly, who communicated through intermediaries and border skirmishes and the occasional corpse left somewhere visible. Victor Draven was calling his personal number. Rhett sat very still for exactly 3 seconds. Then he answered. "Mr. Vallon," said the voice on the other end. It was a smooth voice, carefully modulated, the voice of a man who had spent a great deal of time deciding how he sounded. "I believe you have something of mine." Rhett's hand tightened very slightly on the phone. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I think you do," Victor Draven said. "Her name is Isla, and she's my sister." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Rhett had heard in years. Rhett didn't move. He sat behind his desk with the phone pressed against his ear and the name Victor Draven hanging in the air between them like smoke, and he breathed through it, in through the nose, out slow. The way he'd trained himself to breathe when the ground shifted under him. Not because it calmed him, but because it bought him the 2 or 3 seconds he needed to decide who he was going to be in the next 60 seconds. "Say that again," he said. "Isla Draven," Victor said. 28 years old, 5'5". Dark hair, dark eyes. Works as a housekeeper under a name she chose herself when she decided she was too good for the family she came from. A pause. "My sister. Currently, I believe, inside your estate." Rhett's thumb was pressed flat against the edge of the desk. He could feel the wood grain under it. He focused on that, the physical fact of the desk, the room, the specific weight of the phone, and kept his voice exactly where he needed it. "You have a sister," he said. "I have a sister," Victor said, "and you're going to want to think very carefully about your next move, Mr. Vallon, because she is the one thing in this world I don't negotiate about. I don't respond well to implications. That wasn't an implication, that was a courtesy call." Victor's voice stayed smooth throughout all of it, the kind of smooth that took work, that was a performance of composure rather than the genuine article. Rhett had been performing composure long enough to recognize the difference. "Return her to me, and we have no issue. Keep her, and we have every issue." "She's not property," Rhett said. "She can't be returned." A beat. "She is my family. She's a woman who works for me. She's in my house because she was assaulted and needed medical attention." He paused. "If she wants to speak to you, she'll speak to you. That's her choice. Not mine. Not yours." The silence on Victor's end lasted long enough to tell Rhett something useful. The man had expected either capitulation or aggression, and he'd gotten neither, and the calibration was throwing him. "You don't know who she is," Victor said finally. "I know who she is to me," Rhett said. "I'm going to end this call now. If you want to discuss territory or business, use the appropriate channels. Don't call this number again." He hung up. He set the phone on the desk in front of him and looked at it for a moment. Then he stood up slowly and walked to the window and stood there the same way he'd stood in his office the day before, watching the city. But the city looked different now. It looked like it had rearranged itself while he wasn't paying attention. Victor Draven had a sister. Her name was Isla. She was upstairs. He didn't go up immediately. That was a decision he made in the 30 seconds after hanging up. Not yet. Not while the information was still too new. Not while the particular combination of feelings moving through him hadn't separated into anything he could manage individually. He needed to know the shape of this before he walked into that room. He called Garrett. "Victor Draven," he said. "Family. I need his full personal profile. Parents, siblings, domestic history. I need it fast." "How fast?" "I'm walking upstairs in 20 minutes. Have something for me before then." Garrett called back in 14. "Victor Draven, 34, Garrett said, took over the organization from his father, Marcus Draven, 6 years ago after the old man's stroke. One sister, Isla Marie Draven, 28. Left the family home 7 years ago, no forwarding address. Victor's had people looking for her on and off for the last 5. Lost the trail in Cincinnati, picked it up again briefly in Indianapolis, nothing after that until..." Garrett paused. "Until now, apparently." "How did he find her?" "Unknown. Could be the hospital call. Dr. Walsh's practice has a patient registration system that..." "Fix that," Rhett said. "Today." "Already on it." He hung up. Stood in the hallway at the base of the stairs. The house was quiet around him in the particular way it got in the late afternoon, when the day staff had cleared out and the evening security rotation hadn't fully settled. He could hear the kitchen, someone in there, moving around. He went to the kitchen first. Isla was at the stove, not cooking anything complicated. She was heating soup from a can, the kind of thing you do when you're injured and hungry and haven't had the energy to think about food seriously. She was standing with her weight on one hip, slightly favoring the right side, and she was stirring slowly, not because the soup required slow stirring, but because her ribs required her to move carefully in all directions. She heard him come in and looked over her shoulder. Whatever she saw in his face made her turn around fully, which cost her something. He could see it in the slight tightening around her eyes. "What happened?" she said. He pulled out the chair at the kitchen island and sat down. He looked at her steadily. "Victor Draven called my personal number 40 minutes ago." The spoon in her hand went still. "He told me you're his sister," Rhett said, "that your name is Isla Draven, that he's been looking for you." He paused. "I'm giving you the opportunity to tell me your version before I decide what to do with mine." She turned back to the stove, turned off the burner, set the spoon down on the counter beside it with a careful, deliberate precision that was doing a lot of work, keeping her hands occupied, buying herself seconds, managing something he couldn't see from where he was sitting. "How long have you known?" she said. Her voice was level. The throat was still damaged. He could hear it. 41 minutes. She turned around and leaned back against the counter and looked at him. Her arms crossed over her chest, carefully, the ribs, and her chin came up slightly, which he recognized as a defensive gesture from someone who had decided that the best defense available to her was to look like she wasn't defending anything. "I left when I was 21, she said. "Victor had just taken over from my father. I'd spent my entire life watching what that family was, what it did, what it cost the people inside it and outside it, and I decided I was done." She held his gaze. "I changed my name. I built a life. I was very careful about not being found. For 7 years. For 7 years. And then you took a job working for the rival organization of the family you were hiding from," he said. Something moved through her expression. Not guilt, exactly, but an acknowledgement of how that sounded. "I didn't know who you were when I applied. I knew you ran a large operation. The nature of it wasn't advertised in the job posting." A pause. "When I figured it out, I'd already been here for 3 months and I needed the work, and I told myself it didn't matter because Victor didn't know where I was." "He knows now." "He knows now," she agreed. Rhett looked at her for a long moment. He was running through the geometry of the situation, what it meant for his organization, what it meant for the territory war that had been simmering with Draven for 3 years, what leverage it created, and what vulnerabilities. These were the calculations he ran automatically, the way other men breathed. He was also running through something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with leverage. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. She blinked. Whatever question she'd been bracing for, it wasn't that one. "Tell you what? Who you were. What you were running from. Any of it." "Because you're my employer," she said. "Not my—" "You said that yesterday," he said. "It didn't hold then. It doesn't hold now." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the island. "We've been in the same house for 3 years. You know how I take my coffee. You know I read 2 newspapers on Tuesday and none on Wednesday. You know I don't eat breakfast after 6 a.m. workouts. I know that you cry at foreign films and pretend you have allergies. I know that you leave a light on in the kitchen when you're the last one out." He paused. "We're not strangers, Isla. Whatever else we are, we're not that." She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. The soup was going cold in the pan behind her. "I was afraid," she said finally. Her voice went flat when she said it. Not emotionless, but the flatness of someone saying something they've been holding for a long time and have finally decided to set down. "Not of you. Of what knowing would change. About whether you'd keep me on. About whether I'd become a problem." "You're not a problem. I'm Victor Draven's estranged sister sitting in the house of Victor Draven's primary rival," she said. "I'm exactly a problem." He looked at her. "Are you a threat?" "No." "Are you working for him?" "No." "Have you told him anything about my operation?" "Never. I didn't even tell him where I was." "I believe you," he said. She stopped, processed that. You believe me? Yes. You've known me for 41 minutes as someone who withheld something significant, she said. And you believe me? I've known you for 3 years, he said. The last 41 minutes is a footnote. She looked away first. He watched her look away. The line of her jaw, the way she breathed through whatever the moment was doing to her, the careful management of it. She reached behind her and picked up the pan and carried it to the sink and stood there for a moment with her back to him. He's going to come for me, she said. I know. Not because he loves me, because I'm his. That's how he thinks about people. She set the pan down. He spent 5 years looking for me. That's not love, that's ownership. I know what it is, Rhett said. I've been dealing with him for 3 years. She turned around. What are you going to do? He looked at her steadily. Keep you safe. That's not a plan. It's the beginning of one. She held his gaze, and in her eyes he could see the specific tiredness of a woman who had been running for 7 years and had just discovered that the place she'd stopped running to had its own set of wolves. He recognized that tiredness. He'd seen it in the mirror in other contexts. Okay, she said. Quiet. Not surrender. Something more like a decision. Okay. Damon came back that evening. He didn't call ahead, which was unusual. He showed up at the gate at 7 p.m., and Marcus let him through because Marcus let Damon through, always had, and because nothing in the protocols said otherwise. Rhett was in the study when Damon walked in. Isla was on the second floor. This configuration, Damon in the study, Isla upstairs, the invisible geometry of their positions in the house, was something Rhett would think about later. I heard about Draven, Damon said, dropping into the chair. Marcus, Damon confirmed. He wasn't apologetic about it. In 11 years, the two of them had operated on total information sharing. No silos, no blind spots between them. This was the first time Rhett had reason to think about whether that was still entirely true. She's Victor's sister, Damon said. Yes. And you're going to keep her here? Yes. Damon looked at him. The look had a texture to it. Not quite accusation, not quite concern, something occupying the overlap between the two. Rhett, think about what you're doing. I know what I'm doing. Do you? Damon leaned forward. Victor Draven has been trying to carve pieces off this organization for 3 years. And now his sister, who has been living in your house with access to your schedule and your security patterns and your people, is suddenly visible to him. You don't think that's a play? She didn't know he'd find her here. You're sure about that? The temperature in the room dropped slightly. I'm sure, Rhett said. You're sure because she told you she's sure, Damon said. That's different. I've known her for 3 years. You've known the name she gave you for 3 years. Damon's voice was careful, controlled, but underneath it, there was something running hot that Rhett was now cataloging. You don't know Isla Draven. You know Isla Voss. That's whoever she decided to be when she was hiding. Rhett looked at him steadily. And your recommendation? Move her somewhere neutral. A property she doesn't know, off the main network. Keep her comfortable, keep her safe, but away from the operational center. Damon held his gaze. This house is the operational center. She's already been here 3 years. She already knows too much. No. Rhett. No, Rhett said again. Final. The kind of final that didn't invite argument. Damon sat back, his jaw tightened. He looked at the bookshelf to Rhett's left for a moment, the way people look at something neutral when they're deciding whether to say the thing they actually want to say. You like her, Damon said. She works for me. That's not what I said. Damon. The edge in his voice was sharper this time, sharper than he'd intended, and he recognized that sharpness for what it was, not warning, but reaction. The specific reaction of someone who has been accurately perceived doing something they'd prefer not to be perceived doing. Damon stood up. He put his jacket on slowly, deliberately, with the slightly too controlled movements of a man managing himself. I've been with you 11 years, he said. I've watched you make decisions. I've seen you wrong twice and right every other time. I'm telling you this is the 3rd time. Noted, Rhett said. Damon looked at him for a moment. Then he walked out. Rhett sat in the quiet of the study after the door closed and breathed through the conversation, examining what was left of it. He'd known Damon for 11 years. He knew the architecture of that man's mind, the load-bearing walls of it. The argument Damon had made was rational on its surface, well-constructed, reasonable, the kind of case a competent lieutenant should make. But underneath it, running below the rational surface like water beneath ice, was something else, something personal. Something Rhett had clocked when Damon's eyes moved to the ceiling, toward the second floor, for the third time in the last 2 hours. He filed it carefully. He did not know yet what to do with it. 3 days passed. The estate settled into a new rhythm, the way water settles into a new container. The same substance, different shape. Isla moved through the house carefully, managing her ribs, and the house moved around her with a new awareness of her presence that was different from how it had moved around her before. Before, she had been staff, trusted, valued, respected in the particular way that Rhett respected competence. Now she was something the house didn't have a category for. She wasn't a guest. She helped in the kitchen, argued with Marguerite the cook about prep methods, reorganized the linen closet on the second floor on a Tuesday afternoon because it was, she said, an organizational catastrophe. She wasn't staff. She sat at the dinner table in the evenings. When Rhett ate at the table and not his desk, and they talked the way people talk when they've stopped pretending the conversation is about something transactional, he learned things. He learned that she'd studied art history for 2 years before the money ran out, and she'd needed to work. That she read in the bath, always had, and went through 3 or 4 books a week. That she had an opinion about everything. City politics, architecture, the best place to get coffee within 4 blocks of the estate. And that her opinions were delivered without preamble, directly, the way she moved through rooms, efficiently and without wasted steps. He learned that she laughed at things he said that other people didn't laugh at, and that when she did it was involuntary, a small thing, half suppressed, like she hadn't intended to find him funny and was slightly annoyed about it. He learned that she'd been alone for most of the last 7 years, that the women she'd worked alongside at previous jobs had been kind but not close, that the men she'd dated had been ordinary in ways that she'd convinced herself were what she wanted and then couldn't sustain. That Tyler Kane had seemed at first like stability, and had turned out to be a different kind of cage than the one she'd escaped. He didn't learn these things directly. She didn't sit down and deliver them. He assembled them from fragments, from the pauses between sentences, from what she didn't say in response to certain questions, from the way she looked at the garden on evenings when she thought he wasn't watching. On the 4th night, he found her in the library at 11 p.m. She was in the armchair by the east window with her knees pulled up and a book face down on the armrest. Not reading, just sitting in the particular stillness of someone whose mind is moving fast and whose body has gone quiet to accommodate it. She looked up when he came in. She had the slightly unfocused look of someone coming back from a long way away. "Can't sleep," she said. "I don't sleep much," he said. "Usually." He sat down in the chair across from her, not because he'd been invited, but because she didn't object. And he picked up the book from the armrest and turned it over to look at the cover. A novel. He didn't know it. "Any good?" he said. "I can't tell yet. I keep reading the same paragraph." He set it down. She was looking at him with an expression that had something gathering in it, something that had been building and hadn't found its exit yet. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why are you doing this?" She gestured slightly, the gesture taking in the house, the situation, all of it. "Victor is dangerous. Keeping me here is a liability. You know that. Damon told you that, and he wasn't wrong." Her voice was even. "So why?" He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the version of himself that answered this question with the operational rationale. Victor would see backing down as weakness. Maintaining proximity to her gave him intelligence leverage. It was a strategic holding pattern. He had all of those answers ready. He'd been using them on himself for 4 days. "Because someone hurt you," he said, "and I can make sure it doesn't happen again, so I'm making sure." She was very still. "That's it?" she said. "That's it." She held his gaze. Something in her face moved. Not softened exactly, but shifted, the way a tightly held thing shifts when it's been held too long, and the muscles give a little. Then she looked back at the window, at the garden dark beyond the glass. "Rhett," she said. "Yeah. I'm scared." quiet, simple. 3 words that had clearly cost her something to say. He didn't offer her reassurance. She wasn't asking for it. He sat across from her in the dark library and said, "I know." And the two of them were quiet for a while, and it was the most honest conversation he'd had in years. On the 6th day, Damon Cross stopped coming to the estate. He sent his updates through Marcus. His calls went to voicemail and returned his texts. The Standing Tuesday meeting became a set of files left at the front desk, annotated in Damon's cramped handwriting. Rhett read them, responded through the same channel, and didn't push. He should have pushed. He knew, in the cold, analytical center of himself that never fully shut off, that Damon's withdrawal was a data point, and that data points required investigation. But there was a competing logic at work. The logic of the 5-year friendship. The logic of assuming he understood Damon's internal landscape well enough to read this correctly as wounded pride, rather than something structural. He had given Damon the benefit of the doubt for 11 years, and had never had cause to regret it. He regretted it on the 7th day. Garrett called at 8 a.m. "Tyler Kane," Garrett said. Rhett's hand tightened on the phone. "What about him?" "He's gone. Packed up his apartment, quit his job, took a car we can't track. As of 2 days ago." A pause. "We lost the tail." "How?" "He was helped," Garrett said. "Deliberately and professionally. Someone flagged him that he was being watched and gave him a route out." Rhett was quiet for 3 seconds. "Who?" "Still working on that. Work faster." He hung up and sat very still in his office and ran through the list of people who had known about the surveillance on Kane. It was a short list. The people on it were people he trusted absolutely. One of them had moved Kane. He went through the list again and again, turning each name over, looking at it from every angle, and each time he came to the same name last, not because it was least likely, but because of the resistance, the specific resistance of someone who has been calling something friendship for 11 years and doesn't want to look at what it has become. The call came at 9:47 that evening. Rhett was in the study. Isla was on the 2nd floor. The house was quiet. His phone lit up with Damon's name. "I need to see you," Damon said. "Not at the estate. Southside. The warehouse on Cermak." "Why?" "Because what I have to tell you isn't something I want on a network." A pause. "Bring whoever you want. I'll come alone." Rhett looked at the phone for a moment. He thought about Garrett's call that morning. He thought about Kane, moved cleanly and professionally by someone who knew exactly how the surveillance operation worked. He thought about Damon's eyes moving to the ceiling, toward Isla, 3 times in 2 hours. "I'll come alone," Rhett said. He went upstairs first, knocked once. She opened the door in the half-light of the room behind her, reading glasses pushed up on her head, a book in her hand. "I have to go out," he said. She looked at him. Whatever she saw in his face, she read it correctly. "Is it Damon?" He didn't ask how she knew. "Stay in the house. Don't open the gate for anyone except Marcus. If anything feels wrong, call this number." He held out a card with a number she didn't have. "Not my number. This number. Straight to the security team." She took the card. Their fingers touched briefly, which was nothing, which was also not nothing. "Be careful," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Lock the door," he said, and went downstairs and out into the night, toward whatever Damon had. The warehouse on Cermak was a concrete box from the 1940s that had survived 3 owners, 2 fires, and 1 federal investigation without giving up anything useful to anyone. Rhett had used it for meetings before, the kind of meetings that didn't generate paperwork. The ceiling was high and dark, the floor was bare concrete that held the cold up from the earth beneath it, and the single working light hung from a cable in the center and threw a circle of yellow that made everything outside it look like a decision. Damon was already there. He was standing at the edge of the light, jacket on, hands in his pockets, and he was alone. Rhett had checked the perimeter before entering, old habit, non-negotiable, but alone in a way that felt constructed, deliberate, the way a man stands when he has rehearsed what comes next. Rhett walked in and let the door close behind him and crossed the floor to the edge of the light and stopped, 10 feet between them. He didn't speak. Damon looked at him. In the yellow light, his face had the quality of something excavated, all the surface worn off, the structure underneath exposed. He looked older than 38. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had arrived at the point where putting it down was the only option left, regardless of what it broke on impact. "You should have sent her away," Damon said. "That's not how we start this conversation," Rhett said. "That's exactly how we start it." Damon's voice was flat. "I told you to move her. I told you she was a liability. I told you what bringing her into the center of the operation would do. And you looked at me across your desk and said no, because you were thinking with something other than your head for the first time in your life. And now we're here." Rhett watched him. He was looking for the thing underneath the words, the structural thing, and he was finding it in the way Damon's jaw moved between sentences, and the way his hands were not quite still inside his pockets, and the specific heat in his voice that had nothing to do with strategic concern. "You moved Kane," Rhett said. Damon's mouth tightened, not a denial, not a confirmation, just the tightening, which was its own kind of answer. "You had him flagged," Rhett said. "You told him he was being watched, and you gave him a route out. Why?" "Because she doesn't deserve what you would have done to him." The sentence landed in the cold air of the warehouse and stayed there. "You don't know what I would have done," Rhett said. "I know exactly what you would have done," Damon said. "I've watched you for 11 years. I know what you do to men who touch things that belong to you." "She doesn't belong to me." "Then why is she still in your house?" Damon's voice cracked slightly on the last word, not breaking, just fracturing at the edge, the way ice fractures before it gives. "Why didn't you move her? You know the operational logic. You know what Victor will do. You know what I told you, and you kept her there anyway, and you sat across from her in the library at 11 p.m., and you—" He stopped. The warehouse was very quiet. "You've been watching the house," Rhett said. "I have people watching the house," Damon said, "because someone has to think clearly about the security of this operation when the man running it is occupied." Rhett looked at him for a long moment. Something was settling in his chest. Not anger, not yet. Something colder and more structural than anger, the feeling of a load-bearing wall revealing a crack. "How long?" he said. "How long what?" "How long have you had people watching my house?" "3 weeks." A pause. "Since she came back from Tyler Kane's." Red absorbed this. 3 weeks. Before the assault, before the phone call from Victor, before any of the current situation had materialized. 3 weeks ago, Damon Cross had begun surveilling Rhett Vallen's estate without his knowledge, without his authorization, without his consent. 11 years. "Why?" Rhett said. Damon took his hands out of his pockets. He pressed them against the sides of his thighs and breathed in once through his nose and said, "Because I've been in love with her for 2 years." The silence after this was not a dramatic silence. It was a flat, gray silence. The silence of a fact landing on concrete. No echo, no reverberation, just the dull sound of impact. 2 years, Rhett said. She never knew. Damon's voice was stripped down now, nothing performative left in it. "I never said anything. I never did anything. I just watched her work in that house and watched the way she moved and the way she handled herself. And I thought eventually there would be a moment. I thought eventually—" He stopped again, collected himself. "And then she got hurt, and you brought her home, and I watched you look at her the way you looked at her, and I knew." "Damon, you don't look at things you don't intend to keep," Damon said. "I've watched you for 11 years. I know how you look at things you intend to keep." Rhett breathed through it. He was running through the architecture of his own response, the layers of it, the operational betrayal, the surveillance, Kane's disappearance, and underneath all of that, the human wreckage of it. 11 years. A man who had been his closest thing to family doing all of this in silence, from the inside. "What did you tell Victor?" Rhett said. The shift in Damon's face was small but catastrophic. It was only a second, a half second. The slight widening of the eyes, the infinitesimal pulling back, the micro-expression of a man who has been asked the question he was not prepared for, the question that goes to the thing he cannot explain. "What did you tell Victor Draven?" Rhett said again, and his voice had gone quiet in the way it went quiet when the thing he was managing was no longer anger, but something that existed on the other side of it. "I didn't," Damon started. "Don't." Rhett's voice was soft. "Careful. The way you handle something that could take the building down if mishandled." "Don't do that. Not you. Not after 11 years. Don't stand in front of me and tell me you didn't, because I will know, and it will be worse. Damon's jaw worked. His hands pressed harder against his thighs. He looked at the floor for 1 second, just one, and that second contained everything Rhett needed to know. I told him she was here, Damon said. 2 weeks ago, before she was hurt. I didn't know about Kane then. I didn't know he would... His voice roughened. I thought Victor would come and take her back to his world, and she'd be gone from yours, and eventually things would go back to... Back to what? Rhett said. Damon didn't answer. Back to what, Damon? The quietness in Rhett's voice had a pressure behind it now, the pressure of something enormous held in a very small space. Back to the way they were. Before she came. Before she changed everything in that house just by being in it. The rawness in Damon's voice was complete now, every surface stripped. Before you started leaving your office early, before you started sleeping better, before I watched you become something. He stopped, pressed his lips together. Something I hadn't seen before. Rhett looked at him for a very long time. He thought about the cardinal on the garden wall. He thought about 11 p.m. in the library and a book face down on an armrest. He thought about Isla saying, I'm scared with the specific weight of someone who hadn't said it to anyone in years. He thought about Victor Draven knowing exactly where she was 2 weeks before he'd called, which meant the call hadn't been a discovery. It had been an announcement. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He didn't take his eyes off Damon as he reached for it. The number on the screen was Marcus. He answered, Sir. Marcus's voice had a quality he hadn't heard often. Not panic. Marcus didn't panic. But the controlled urgency of someone managing a situation at the outermost edge of what training covers. The estate. You need to... The sound came through the phone before Marcus finished the sentence. Not an explosion. Something smaller and more deliberate. Glass. A specific high-impact shattering, the kind that comes from a window taken out with something purpose-made. Marcus, Rhett said. They're inside, Marcus said. 4 that I can confirm, possibly more. We have men down on the east wing. Sir, Ms. Voss. The call cut out, not dropped. Cut. Clean severance, which meant it was deliberate, which meant someone had killed the signal at the source. Rhett lowered the phone. He was standing very still. The warehouse was very cold. The single light above them swayed slightly in a draft from somewhere. He turned and looked at Damon. Damon's face had gone the color of concrete. His mouth was slightly open. His hands had come up from his sides in an involuntary gesture, palms out. Not a threatening posture, the opposite. The unconscious display of someone whose body has understood before his mind has caught up that he has arrived at a place he cannot walk back from. I didn't know about tonight, Damon said. His voice was wrecked. Rhett, I swear to you I did not know he would do this tonight. Rhett looked at him. He was looking for the truth in Damon's face because he had 11 years of calibration to work with, and he could read this man with a precision that very few things in his life matched. Damon hadn't known about tonight. That didn't change what Damon had done. Rhett turned and walked toward the door. Rhett, Damon's voice behind him. Let me help. Let me come with you. I can... Stay here, Rhett said. He didn't turn around. Don't call anyone. Don't move. I'll deal with you when this is done. He pushed through the warehouse door into the cold Chicago night, and he was running before it closed behind him. The estate was 7 minutes away by car driven without patience for traffic signals. Rhett made it in 4 minutes and 40 seconds. He came through the service entrance on the north side because the main gate had been compromised. He could see it as he approached, the arm bent at the wrong angle, the security box dark, which meant the power had been selectively cut, professionally done. Precise. This wasn't a mob assault, bodies and noise and brute force. This was a surgical operation by people who had been given very specific information about the layout, the security patterns, the rotation schedules. Damon's information. Damon's maps. He came through the service entrance and moved along the east wall of the garden with the weapon in his hand and his breathing controlled and his mind in the specific state it reached under extreme conditions. Not empty, not calm, but stripped of everything except the problem directly in front of him. This was the state he'd spent years cultivating and years hating himself for, the state that made him very good at very terrible things. 2 men were in the garden. He dealt with them quickly and without noise and kept moving. The east wing windows were breached. He could see it from the garden, 2 frames gone, curtains moving in the cold air. The main security panel on this level was dark. The backup systems had not engaged, which meant someone had been in the house before tonight, someone who knew the location of the backup panel and how to disable it, someone who had walked this house many times. He went through the east window into the ground floor hallway. The hallway was dark, the power cut to this section. He moved by memory. He knew this house in the dark, had walked it enough times at odd hours that the dimensions of it were part of him. A man came around the corner from the kitchen corridor. Rhett registered him in a fraction of a second, tall, professional posture, earpiece visible. And the next 3 seconds were violent and efficient and conclusive. He went up the stairs. The second floor had noise, coming from the south end where the guest suite was. Voices, 2, maybe 3, speaking low and clipped in a communication style that was professional. Not men having a conversation, men executing a task. He moved down the corridor fast and low. The door to the guest suite was open. He came through it at an angle, shoulder first, weapon up, and took in the room in a single sweep. 2 men, one at the window, one near the door to the bathroom, both armed, both turning. He dealt with the one at the window first because proximity dictated it. The second man had time to shout something into an earpiece before Rhett reached him, and that shout would have consequences, which he cataloged and set aside for later. 2 seconds. The room was empty. She wasn't here. He crossed to the bathroom. Empty. Closet. Empty. He stood in the center of the room and turned slowly and breathed and made himself think rather than feel, because feeling right now was a luxury that would get him killed and would not get her back. She'd been gone before they took the room. She'd heard them coming, or she'd been warned. The card. He'd given her the card with the security number. If she'd reached the security team, they'd have moved her. He pulled out the backup phone he kept in his inside pocket. Different number, different network, not on the main system that had been cut, and called the number on the card. 3 rings, 4, 5. A voice, "Sir?" It was Chen, the night security lead. The voice was wrong. Too tight, too controlled. "Sir, we have Ms. Voss. We have her in the—" A sound in the background. Not a struggle. Something worse. The sound of a man who has realized, mid-sentence, that the frame of the situation has just changed. Then a different voice. Smooth, carefully modulated. A voice he'd heard once before, through a phone, but whose quality he had memorized. "Mr. Vallon," said Victor Draven, "don't hang up. I have your people. I have your woman, and I have your house. The question you need to answer in the next 30 seconds is what you're willing to give me to get them back." Rhett stood in the empty room. His hand was absolutely still on the phone. The cold air moved through the broken windows. "What do you want?" he said. "Easy. Territory," Victor said. "The North Side operations. The port contracts. And the Cermak warehouse." A pause that was timed precisely, the pause of a man who had rehearsed this. "You have 48 hours to sign the transfers. If I don't have documentation by midnight Thursday, I start making decisions about the people in this house. And I'll start—" Another pause, deliberate and calculated to land. "I'll start with Isla." The specific quality of what moved through Rhett in that moment was not something he had a name for. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something older and more absolute than both of those things, something that moved through him the way current moves through wire, not felt so much as conducted, reorganizing everything it passed through. "Let me speak to her," he said. A shuffle. Then her voice. "Don't." Her voice was tight and controlled, and he could hear the ribs in it, and he could hear something else in it. Not fear, something harder than fear. "Don't give him anything. Don't—" Her voice cut off. Not cut out. Cut off. 48 hours, Victor said. "Choose carefully." The line went dead. Rhett stood in the center of the empty room for 4 seconds. He looked at the card on the nightstand. The card he'd given her, face up, set down deliberately where it could be seen. She'd left it there for him, so he'd know she'd tried to call. So he'd know she'd been taken before she could get through. Even then, even in the moment of being taken, she'd thought about what he needed to know. He put the phone in his pocket. He walked out of the room and down the hallway and down the stairs, past the men on the ground floor he'd have to deal with, past the broken windows and the cut power and the wreckage of the security system that Damon's information had made possible. He walked out through the service entrance into the cold night air and stood there for a moment with the city spread out around him, and he understood with complete and terrible clarity that the man he'd been for the last 7 days, the man who had sat in a library at 11 p.m. and talked about fear, the man who had watched a cardinal on a garden wall and thought about what it felt like to be safe, that man was going to have to stand aside. What came next required the other one, the one the city knew, the one that had built this empire out of nothing, that had looked at other men's power and taken it apart piece by piece, that had never once in 15 years allowed anyone to take something from him and keep it. He took out his phone, called Garrett. "Get me everything," he said. "Every location Victor Draven owns or controls, every property, every safe house, every warehouse and dock and parking garage. I want it by morning." "All of it?" Garrett said. "All of it," Rhett said. "And get me Holloway, and Park, and the Mercer brothers." "That's a war council," Garrett said. "Yes," Rhett said. He was already walking toward the car. "It is." He drove back toward Cermak, toward the warehouse where Damon Cross was still waiting, because there was one more conversation that needed to happen before the war council. One more thing that needed to be. Damon was exactly where Rhett had left him. He was sitting on the floor of the warehouse with his back against a concrete pillar and his forearms on his knees and his head down, the posture of a man who has been waiting in the dark with nothing but his own thoughts for company and has not enjoyed the experience. He looked up when Rhett came through the door. The single overhead light was still swaying slightly in the draft, throwing its yellow circle across the floor, and Rhett walked into that circle and stopped and looked at Damon for a moment without speaking. Damon got to his feet, slowly. He looked at Rhett's face, and whatever he saw there took something out of him. Rhett watched it happen, the slight deflation, the going still. "They took her," Damon said. Not a question. "They took her," Rhett said. "Victor's people. 4 confirmed inside the estate, possibly more. 2 of my men are down." He paused. "Your floor plans, your rotation schedules, your security panel locations. That's how they got in clean." Damon pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. His eyes were doing something complicated. "I gave Victor her location," he said. "I didn't give him—" "You told him she was there," Rhett said. "He did the rest. He had people watching my house, Damon. People who knew your face, who your people probably waved through because they recognized them from your operation. He used your surveillance to run his own." Damon turned away. He walked 3 steps toward the wall and stopped with his hand flat against the concrete and his back to the room. His shoulders were up around his ears and his breathing was audible in the cold air. "I didn't want this," Damon said. "I know what you wanted," Rhett said. "It doesn't matter now." "Rhett, look at me." Damon turned around. Rhett looked at him steadily. He'd had 7 minutes in the car to decide what this moment was going to be, what shape to give it. He'd gone through anger, real anger, deep and structural, the kind that wanted to express itself in ways that would feel correct and solve nothing. He'd gone through the temptation to do to Damon exactly what Damon had feared Rhett would do to Kane. He'd gone through all of it and come out the other side into something colder and more functional. "I need you," Rhett said. Damon blinked. "I have a war council at 6 a.m., Rhett said. "I have 48 hours before Victor starts making decisions about the people in my house. I need every piece of intelligence you have on his operation, locations, personnel, vulnerabilities. I need your network and your contacts and 11 years of the knowledge you carry around in your head." He paused. "And I need to know if you're capable of doing that, if what's left of what we built together is enough for you to show up." Damon was very still. His jaw worked. His eyes were bright with something that had no useful outlet. "After," Rhett said. "After she's safe, we're going to finish this conversation, all of it. And I don't know what that looks like yet. But right now, tonight, I'm asking you to choose." The warehouse was silent. Outside, the city made its nighttime sounds. Distant traffic, the wind off the lake, the particular frequency of a city that never fully sleeps. "Tell me where the council is," Damon said. The War Council convened at 6 a.m. in the basement of a restaurant in Wicker Park that Rhett owned through 3 layers of corporate structure. The restaurant was closed. The basement had a table that seated 12 and a whiteboard and 3 screens on the east wall that Garrett had already populated with everything he'd assembled overnight. Holloway was there. 60s, gray-haired, ran the South Side operations with a precision that bordered on compulsive. Park was there. Youngest person in the room, 31, oversaw the financial infrastructure and had a mind for structural vulnerabilities that Rhett had never seen matched. The Mercer brothers, Cal and Dean, who between them controlled the port operations and had the specific kind of operational experience that came from 15 years of managing things that couldn't be discussed in daylight. Garrett himself. Marcus, ribs taped under his shirt from the previous night, who had refused to go to a hospital and whose presence was a form of communication Rhett received clearly. And Damon, at the far end of the table, who sat with his hands flat in front of him and his eyes on the screens and said nothing in the first 20 minutes that wasn't directly operational. Rhett stood at the whiteboard and laid it out. Victor Draven's organization had 3 primary operational centers in Chicago. The main base was a fortified compound on the waterfront in the southeast, a converted industrial complex that had been retrofitted extensively, reinforced walls, generator backup, a security system that Garrett's team had spent the night trying to map and had gotten 70% of before hitting walls. 2 secondary locations, a warehouse network near the stockyards and a residential building in Hyde Park that served as a communications hub. "He'll have her at the waterfront," Damon said. Everyone looked at him. He didn't look up from the table. "It's the most defensible. It's where he takes things he wants to keep." "You've been inside it?" Rhett said. "Once. 18 months ago, before we knew how deep the conflict was going to run. We had a back-channel conversation, me and 2 of his people. I know the entrance layout, the first 2 interior corridors, and the location of the central security room." He paused. "I don't know what's been changed since." "It's more than we had," Rhett said. "They spent 3 hours planning. Real planning. The kind that accounts for variables and failure points and the specific ways that the best-designed operations go wrong in the field. Rhett ran it the way he ran everything, methodically, without illusion, asking the questions that were uncomfortable because they were the questions that needed to be asked. By 9 a.m., they had a structure. By 10, they had assignments. By 11, when the council broke to execute, they had something that might work and several contingencies for when it didn't. Garrett stayed behind. He waited until the room cleared and then said, 48-hour deadline. Victor's playing a timeline." "Yes," Rhett said. "He doesn't want the territory," Garrett said. "Or he does. But that's not the primary objective. The primary objective is her." "I know. He's using the deadline to control your decision-making, pressure you into a direct move rather than a careful one." Garrett looked at him. "Which is what you're doing anyway." "There's no careful move here," Rhett said. "There's a fast move and a slow move. The slow move costs more. In lives." "In hers," Rhett said. "Specifically." Garrett looked at him for a moment. He was not a man who commented on the personal dimensions of operational decisions. He nodded once and left. They moved at 2 a.m., not the full council. The council had dispersed to create simultaneous pressure on Victor's secondary locations, a deliberate fragmentation of his attention and resources designed to pull security away from the waterfront in the 2 hours before the primary strike. Cal Mercer hit the Stockyards warehouse at 1:40. Park's team disabled the Hyde Park communications hub at 1:50. Both actions were noise, orchestrated chaos, designed to read on Victor's network as the main event. The main event was Rhett, Damon, and 7 men moving across the waterfront in the dark. The lake wind was brutal. It came off the water with the specific malice of a Chicago February, not cold in the way of temperature alone, but cold in the way of intention, finding every gap in clothing, making precise work imprecise. Rhett's hands were bare because gloves reduce sensitivity, and he needed his hands to be fully functional tonight. They came in from the waterside, using the dock access that Garrett's overnight reconnaissance had identified as the lowest coverage approach. 2 guards at the dock entrance. Rhett's team dealt with them in under 15 seconds, clean and quiet, the way it needed to be done for the next 8 minutes to work. Inside, the industrial complex was lit the way working warehouses are lit. Not bright, not atmospheric, but functional, strips of fluorescent along the ceiling that turned everything below them into a flat, shadowless plane. This was the worst kind of environment for an infiltration, the kind that eliminated the cover of darkness, that made every movement visible to anyone looking in the right direction. Damon moved up beside him at the first interior junction. Security room is left corridor, 60 meters, third door. His voice was barely a breath. If it follows the layout I saw. If, Rhett said. If, Damon agreed. Rhett sent 2 men left with Damon. He took the other 5 and moved right toward the deeper interior because the security room was a distraction, and what he needed was to find Isla before Victor's people finished realizing they were inside. They found the first resistance at the second corridor junction, 2 of Victor's men, armed and alert, who had clearly been expecting something tonight, even if not this specific approach vector. The next 40 seconds were loud in a way that 40 seconds had not been allowed to be before now, which meant the clock had changed, which meant everything moved faster from this point. He kept moving. His left arm had taken a graze from the second man's weapon. Not a serious wound, a surface tear along the forearm that was bleeding steadily, but not in a way that impaired function. He registered it the way he registered information. Noted, filed, not processed emotionally, dealt with after. His earpiece crackled. Damon's voice. "Security room is down. We have the cameras. Talk to me," Rhett said. 3 rooms visible in the interior. 2 have guards posted outside. 1 doesn't. A pause. The one without guards is in the northeast corner, ground level. Rhett, I can see her on one of the feeds. She's... Damon's voice did something. She's upright. She's okay. Something in his chest released approximately 3% of the pressure it had been holding for the last 18 hours. "Northeast corner," he said. "I'm going." "You've got 6 men between you and that corridor," Damon said. "Victor's positioned them deliberately. He's expecting me," Rhett said. "Good." He moved through Victor Draven's fortress like he was walking through a house he owned. Not recklessly. Every step was measured, every corner was cleared, the 7 years of operational experience and the 11 before that on the street ran underneath every movement like a current. But there was no hesitation in him. There was no calculation of whether this was worth the cost, because the answer to that question had been decided 18 hours ago in an empty bedroom with a card face-up on a nightstand. The 6 men between him and the northeast corridor were managed in a way that cost him time and a cut across his right hand from a blade he hadn't tracked fast enough. He registered the cut the same way he'd registered the arm. Noted, filed, continued. The corridor to the northeast room was 30 feet of straight line, no cover, 1 overhead light. At the far end, a door. In front of the door, a man who was approximately 6'3" and carrying enough hardware to make the 30 feet very complicated. And beside that man, stepping out of the shadows of the corridor's midpoint, where he'd been waiting with the specific patience of someone who had known exactly how Rhett would move through his building. Victor Draven. He was not what Rhett had expected, which was itself a piece of information. He'd expected something operatic. Victor Draven in person was medium height, composed, wearing a jacket that looked expensive and a face that looked like Isla's. Not identical, but the same underlying structure, the same quality of bone and jaw, the same dark eyes, except without anything in them that resembled what he'd learned to look for in hers. He was holding a phone. "Mr. Vallon," he said, "I have to say, I expected you to wait until tomorrow at least. You have 22 hours remaining." "I don't wait," Rhett said. "No." Victor looked at him with an analytical attention that was entirely without warmth. "You don't." He glanced down at the phone in his hand. "I've been watching you move through my building on this feed for the last 9 minutes. You're very good at this." "Open the door," Rhett said. "In a moment." Victor tilted his head slightly. "I want you to understand something first. Not as a negotiation, just as a fact you should have before whatever comes next. Isla is my sister. She left. I understand why she left. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. What I cannot allow is for her to be used." "Used," Rhett said. "You brought her into the center of your operation. Whether deliberately or through proximity, she is now a piece on the board. Men in your position don't have relationships. They have leverage points. I've watched what this life does to people who matter to men like us." His voice stayed level throughout all of it. "I am trying to remove her from that. By having her kidnapped. By bringing her home. She doesn't want to go home. Rhett said. "She left your home 7 years ago. She built something else. You don't get to take that apart because you've decided you know better." Something moved in Victor's face. Not emotion exactly, the shadow of it, the place where emotion would be if he'd allowed it more access. "She's my family," he said. "She's her own person," Rhett said. "Which you'd know if you'd spent the last 7 years listening instead of looking." The man at the door had shifted slightly during this exchange, the almost imperceptible repositioning of someone waiting for an instruction. Victor's hand moved on the phone. The corridor was 30 feet of straight line and one overhead light, and the specific silence of two men who had said what they'd come to say. "Open the door," Rhett said again, "or I open it myself." Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the man by the door and nodded. The door opened. Isla came out of the room already moving, not stumbling, not faltering, but walking with the tight, controlled movement of someone who has been conserving themselves and is now done conserving. Her hands were free. Someone had removed the restraints, probably when the alarm started. She was pale, and her jaw was set, and her eyes found Rhett immediately, and something passed between them in that fraction of a second that didn't need language and didn't need time. She walked past her brother without looking at him and came to Rhett's side. Victor watched her do it. He watched the way she moved toward Rhett, not running, not desperate, but direct, the way water moves toward where it's going. His face did something that Rhett recognized because he'd felt it himself in the last 18 hours. The particular expression of a man watching something he can't stop and beginning to understand that he can't stop it. "Isla," Victor said. She stopped, turned, looked at her brother with an expression that contained 7 years of everything, the grief of it and the anger and the love underneath both, the complicated wreckage of a family that had never known how to hold its members without crushing them. "I'm not yours," she said. "I haven't been yours since I was 21. You don't get to decide where I'm safe. You don't get to decide who I'm safe with." Her voice was steady throughout. The ribs were still there. He could hear them in the careful management of each breath, but the steadiness was entirely her own. "If you want to be part of my life, that's a conversation we can have, but not like this. Never like this again." Victor was quiet. "Do you understand me?" she said, a long silence. Then, very quietly, "Yes." "Good." She turned back to Rhett. Rhett looked at Victor over her head. The man by the door was still standing there. The phone was still in Victor's hand. The corridor was still a 30-foot straight line between where they stood and where they needed to be. "We're leaving," Rhett said. "I know," Victor said. They turned. They walked toward the end of the corridor. Rhett kept his peripheral awareness on the space behind them. The guard, Victor, the possibility of the moment changing. And it was in that peripheral awareness that he caught it. The small movement. Victor's hand tightening on the phone. The guard by the door who had closed it again, whose posture had shifted from waiting to something more loaded. And from the earpiece, Damon's voice, tight and fast. "Rhett." The secondary locations, Victor's pulling his people back. Not scattering, consolidating. He's pulling everything back to the waterfront. He was never trying to hold you off. He was pulling you in. The corridor lights went out. Not a failure. A switch. Rhett grabbed Isla's arm in the complete dark and pulled her against the wall, and he could hear his own heartbeat and her breathing, and behind them in the darkness, the sound of the guard by the door moving, and Victor's voice saying something clipped and professional into the phone that was not addressed to Rhett at all. That was an instruction to someone else entirely, and from outside the building, distant but getting less distant with every second, the sound of vehicles. Multiple vehicles. Moving fast. Victor's entire consolidated force descending on one location, this location. "Run," Rhett said into the dark lasted 4 seconds. Rhett had Isla by the arm and they were moving before the second was done. Flat against the corridor wall, navigating by the memory of the space he'd committed coming in. 30 feet, door at the far end, junction left, then the longer corridor back toward the dock entrance. He moved fast and she kept up, which was something he registered with the part of his brain that was still cataloging. She was hurt, the ribs were real, and she was keeping up without a sound. Behind them, Victor was shouting into the phone. The guard by the door was moving, audible in the dark by the scrape of boots on concrete, but moving cautiously because the dark was universal, It didn't favor anyone. Rhett's earpiece. Damon, clipped and fast. I've got you on the last working camera. Dock entrance is clear right now. You have maybe 90 seconds before the first vehicles reach the perimeter. My men, Rhett said, pulling out on the north side. Mercer's covering. Go. They reached the corridor junction. Left. He kept his hand on Isla's arm. Not gripping, guiding, his palm at her elbow with enough pressure to steer without pulling. She matched his pace and his direction and didn't ask questions, which told him everything about what she'd been doing with herself in that room while she waited. The dock corridor was long and straight and had one working light at the far end that turned everything into silhouette. They ran. Rhett's arm was bleeding through his sleeve. He could feel the warmth of it, the specific weight of blood-soaked fabric, and his right hand was stiffening from the cut across the palm, and he ran through both of these the way he ran through everything physical, which was to note the limitation and continue. Behind them, the building was waking up. Lights coming back on in sections, someone on a manual override working through the system. And with the lights came noise, boots, and voices, and the specific acoustic signature of a large number of people organizing themselves in a confined space. They hit the dock entrance at a run. Outside, the lake wind hit them like a wall. Cold air, the smell of water and diesel, the city's nighttime glow reflecting off the cloud cover overhead, in a dirty orange that turned everything below it the color of old photographs. Rhett's team was moving along the dock. He could see them, dark shapes against the darker water, converging on the two boats that Garrett had positioned. Damon was at the near boat. He saw them coming and reached out a hand, and Isla took it and stepped down into the boat, and Damon held her arm steady while she found her footing. And the look that passed between them in those 2 seconds was something that Rhett watched and understood and filed in the complicated place where he kept the things about Damon that were not yet resolved. Rhett stepped into the boat, and they pushed off from the dock, and the engine came up, and they moved away across the black water just as the first vehicles reached the waterfront perimeter behind them, headlights sweeping the dock, finding the empty space where they'd been standing. Victor's voice, distant now, carrying over the water, something Rhett couldn't make out the words of. He looked at Isla. She was sitting in the stern with her arms around herself against the cold, her hair destroyed by the wind, her face in the orange half-light of the city, showing every hour of the last 24. She was looking back at the waterfront they were leaving, at the sweep of Victor's headlights, at the building they'd come out of. He put his jacket around her shoulders. She looked at him. She didn't say thank you. She just looked at him, and in her eyes was the same thing that had been there in the corridor, the thing without language. And he held it and didn't look away. The boat moved east into the dark. The reckoning with Victor came 3 days later. Not at a warehouse, not at gunpoint, not in the operatic final confrontation that the structure of everything that had preceded it seemed to demand. It came at a neutral table in a building in the West Loop that both organizations used for the occasional transaction that required witnesses neither side fully trusted. Rhett arrived first. Isla was with him, which was a statement he decided to make deliberately, and which he did not explain to anyone. She sat beside him at the table, and she was wearing clothes that fit correctly, and her hair was pulled back, and the bruising on her face had moved from purple to the yellow-green of healing. And she sat with her hands on the table and her back straight, and she looked like what she was, a woman who had made a decision and was present for its consequences. Victor arrived 4 minutes later. He came alone, which matched Rhett's too. He sat across the table, and he looked at his sister, and then he looked at Rhett, and then he looked at the table. And for the first 20 seconds, nobody said anything at all. You pulled everything back to the waterfront, Rhett said. You were trying to pin me in. Yes, Victor said. It didn't work. No. Why? Rhett said. You had the numbers. You had the building. If your people had reached the dock 45 seconds earlier. I know, Victor said. So why did it fail? Victor's eyes moved to Isla, briefly. The flicker of something genuine crossing his face. Not softness, exactly, not apology, but something with the same biological root as both of those things. Because I hesitated, he said. When she walked past me in that corridor, when she chose, he stopped, looked back at Rhett. I hesitated, and the moment passed. The room was quiet. The territory holds, Rhett said. Nothing transfers. The port contracts, the north side operations, everything stays as it was. That's the baseline. Victor's jaw tightened slightly. And in return? In return, this ends, Rhett said. The border skirmishes, the proxy conflicts, the 3 years of taking pieces off each other. It ends. He paused. I'm not interested in your territory. I never was. What I want is a city that works, which it doesn't when two organizations spend their energy dismantling each other. Victor looked at him for a long moment. You're offering a truce. I'm offering a permanent arrangement, not a truce. Truces have expiration dates. Rhett held his gaze. I want your word, not a contract, your word. In front of her. Victor's eyes went to Isla. She was looking at her brother. She'd been looking at him since he sat down, with an expression that was doing many things at once, and he was looking back at her now with the expression of a man who has spent years believing that holding on harder is the same as holding on correctly, and is arriving slowly and at great cost at the understanding that it isn't. I spent 5 years looking for you, Victor said to her. His voice had changed register, stripped of the professional composure. Not because I wanted to control you. I want you to know that. I know that's how it looked. I know that's what it became. But the reason I started, he stopped. When you left, I didn't know if you were safe, that's all. I just didn't know. Isla was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I know that's where it started. I made it into something else. You did. He pressed his lips together. The word that wanted to come out of him clearly cost him something structural, something he'd built his whole adult life to not need. I'm sorry, Isla. She breathed through it. The ribs, still, the careful management. She nodded once, not acceptance of everything, not the erasure of 7 years of running, but something more provisional and real than either of those things. A door cracked open, the possibility of a conversation that wasn't a seizure of property. Give him your word, she said. Victor looked at Rhett. You have my word, he said. Rhett looked at him steadily. He was reading it the way he read everything, for structural integrity, for the load-bearing walls, for whether it would hold under the kind of pressure that reality reliably applied. He believed it. Not completely, not permanently, not without the understanding that this would require maintenance and vigilance and the occasional reminder of consequence, but as a foundation, as a starting position, as the first honest thing said at a table that had previously only hosted dishonest ones, he believed it. Good, he said. Damon came to the estate 4 days after the waterfront. He called ahead this time, which was a change, and Rhett had him shown to the study, and they sat across the desk from each other in the mid-morning light and had the conversation they'd been building toward since a warehouse on Cermak. It took 2 hours. Rhett talked less than Damon, which was unusual, and listened more, which was also unusual. And what he was listening for was not the defense. He'd already adjudicated the facts, and they didn't change, but the person underneath the defense. The man he'd known for 11 years, running through what he'd done and what it had cost and what it meant about what he was. Damon didn't make excuses. That was the thing that mattered most. He laid it out, all of it, including the pieces that made him look the worst, including the places where the line between jealousy and deliberate harm had been thinner than he wanted to admit. He sat across the desk and said the true things, which was the hardest thing Rhett knew of, because the true things never traveled alone. At the end, Rhett said, "You're out of the organization." Damon nodded. He'd known it was coming. His hands were flat on the desk and his face was arranged in the expression of someone absorbing a verdict they've already rendered on themselves. Not permanently, Rhett said. Damon looked up. 12 months, Rhett said. You take a year. You get out of Chicago if that's what it takes. You deal with whatever you need to deal with. At the end of 12 months, if you want to come back, we have another conversation. He paused. That offer expires once. I won't make it twice. Damon was quiet for a long time. Why? He said. After everything. Because 11 years is 11 years, Rhett said. And because you didn't know about the waterfront. And because when I needed you in that basement, you showed up. He looked at him steadily. You made terrible choices, Damon. You're not a terrible person. I know the difference. Damon looked at the desk. His jaw worked. He pressed the bridge of his nose between his thumb and forefinger for a moment, a gesture Rhett had seen him make 100 times in 100 different contexts, and it landed now with a weight it had never had before. 12 months, Damon said. 12 months. Damon stood up. He put out his hand. Rhett looked at it for a moment. The hand that had drawn the floor plans and moved Tyler Kane and made the call to Victor Draven. And then he shook it. Damon left. Rhett sat in the quiet of the study and listened to his footsteps down the hall, and the sound of the front door, and then the silence after, and he breathed through the shape of what the last 2 weeks had done to the landscape of his life. Everything that had been load-bearing before was still there, but distributed differently, resting on different points. He was all right with that. Tyler Kane surfaced 6 weeks later in Milwaukee, which Garrett reported to Rhett with the neutral efficiency of someone delivering information without recommendation. Rhett sat with this information for 2 days. He thought about the knuckle print on Isla's jaw. He thought about the older bruising that Dr. Walsh had mentioned, the pattern of it, the story it told. He thought about what Isla had asked him in the bedroom of the estate 2 weeks before the world changed, don't kill him, and the specific nature of that request, what it had required from her to make it, what it said about who she was. He called Garrett back. Flag him with the Milwaukee PD's domestic violence unit, he said. Anonymously. Full documentation. Dates, injuries, everything my medical team recorded. Make sure it reaches someone who will do something with it. That's all? Garrett said. That's all, Rhett said. He didn't tell Isla about it until that evening, sitting in the kitchen the way they sat in the kitchen now, across from each other with coffee going cold between them, the garden visible through the window. He told her flatly, no build-up, what he'd done and why. She was quiet for a moment. The documentation, she said, would it be enough? It should be enough to open a case. Whether the case moves depends on the prosecutor. He looked at her. It's not guaranteed. Nothing like this is guaranteed. She wrapped both hands around her mug. She was looking at the table, at the grain of the wood, at something in the middle distance that had to do with this, and also with everything before this. It's the right call, she said finally. I thought so. He'll know someone flagged him. Yes. He'll be careful now. About who he... She stopped. About finding someone else. Careful enough not to do it, Rhett said, or careful enough to get caught when he does. He held her gaze. Either way, he's visible now. He was invisible before. She nodded slowly. Not a happy nod. There was no happiness available in this particular conversation, and she was not a person who performed emotions she wasn't having, but a nod that contained something else. The specific weight of a woman who has spent years carrying something alone and has just discovered that the weight can be distributed. Thank you, she said. You already thanked me, he said. You don't have to keep doing it. I'll thank you when I want to, she said. With the edge in her voice that he'd come to understand was the sound of her being comfortable, of her occupying space without apology. He almost smiled. He didn't quite, but it was close. The weeks after that moved differently. Chicago in late spring was a different city from Chicago in February. Not kinder exactly. The city was never kind, but more alive, the lake a different color, the neighborhoods louder and more themselves. Rhett moved through it with the same efficiency he'd always had, and the same precision, the same management of the organization that was his life's primary structure. The truce with Victor held. The territory disputes went quiet. The organization ran. But things inside the walls of the estate had changed in ways that he was still mapping. Isla went back to work, which was her decision, made without asking him and announced as a fact. She showed up at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the waterfront, and made coffee and left the newspaper on the counter and worked her way through the house with the same systematic competence she'd always had. The staff moved around her with a slightly different awareness than before. Not deference, not quite, but the awareness of people who had witnessed something and had updated their understanding of the geometry of the place accordingly. She stayed in the guest suite. This had not been discussed. It had simply continued, day by day, the way things continue when everyone involved is being careful and honest about the fact that they don't yet know what to call what they're doing. He was careful. He was honest with himself about why he was careful. Not caution about her, but caution about himself, about the specific way his life was structured and what it would ask of someone who shared it, about whether what he was offering was something a person could actually inhabit. These were not dramatic questions. They were practical ones. He turned them over in the early mornings when he couldn't sleep, which was most mornings, and he didn't rush the answers. One evening in the second month, she came to find him. He was in the study, late, working through a contract revision that Garrett needed by morning. The house was quiet around him. The security rotation settled into its nighttime pattern, the garden dark beyond the windows. He heard her footsteps in the hallway before she knocked. He always heard her now, had recalibrated to the specific frequency of her movements in this house. "Come in," he said. She came in and sat down in the chair across from his desk. Not the visitor's chair, but the chair to the side, the one that was positioned for conversation rather than presentation. She had a book in her hand, closed, thumb between the pages to hold her place. She looked at him. He set down the contract. "I'm going to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer it honestly, not carefully. Those are different things, and you know it." "All right," he said. "What do you want?" she said. "Not from the organization, not from the city. From this." She moved one hand slightly, indicating the space between them. "What do you actually want?" He looked at her for a long moment. She was right that careful and honest were different things. He spent most of his life being careful in ways that were accurate but not complete, saying the true thing that required the least excavation. She was asking for excavation. "You," he said. "I want you to stay." She held his gaze. "In the house. In my life," he said. "However that looks. I'm not—" He paused. This was the excavation. This was the part that required the thing he was worst at. "I'm not good at this. I don't have a version of myself that's been good at this. You've seen what my life is. You know what it costs the people inside it." "I grew up inside a life like yours," she said. "I know exactly what it costs." "That might be a reason to leave," he said. "Not a reason to stay. Or it means I'm the only person who actually understands what she's agreeing to," she said, rather than finding out later and calling it a betrayal. He breathed through that, the truth of it and the weight of it, the specific quality of being known by someone who had context rather than just goodwill. "I'm not Victor," he said. "I don't want to keep you. I don't want to own this." He looked at her directly. "I want a partner. If that's not what you want, tell me now and we figure out something else. But that's what I want." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I spent 7 years building a life that was safe and small and entirely mine. And it was fine, and I was fine, and I would have stayed fine." She looked at the window, at the dark garden beyond it, at the city lights above the wall. "And then you knocked on my door in the rain, and nothing has been fine since, and I don't want fine anymore." He stood up from the desk. He came around it, and she stood from the chair, and they were very close in the lamplight, close enough that he could see the last of the healing at the corner of her eye, the fine scar at her lip, the permanent evidence of the night that had started all of this. He put his hand against the side of her face, carefully. The same careful that had been in every interaction since the beginning. Not hesitation, but the acknowledgement that this was something that could be broken and that he intended not to break it. She covered his hand with hers. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay," he said. 3 months later, Rhett gathered the organization's senior leadership in the main hall of the estate, 30 people. The men and women who ran the territories, the operations, the financial infrastructure, the legal structures that had grown up around the illegal ones, the full architecture of what he'd spent 15 years building. They stood in the hall with its high ceilings and the evening light coming through the west windows, and they looked at him the way they always looked at him, with the specific quality of attention that power generates in the people proximate to it. Isla stood at his side, not behind him, not to the left or right in the slightly recessed position that indicates secondariness. Beside him, with her shoulders level and her hands still, and her eyes moving across the room with the same quiet assessment they moved across every room, cataloging, understanding, finding the things worth finding. He spoke clearly and without theater, because theater was for people who needed performance to compensate for something. He told them that the organization was restructuring, that 3 of the longest-running illegal operations were being wound down over the next 18 months and replaced with legitimate businesses that had already been identified and in 2 cases already purchased, that the transition was going to cost, short-term, and that anyone who couldn't operate in a structure that was moving toward legality was welcome to make their own arrangements. He told them that the reason for the transition was not weakness and not external pressure and not the result of anyone's demands. It was a decision, his decision, because the organization had reached the scale where its continued operation on its current model was a ceiling, not a floor, and because he'd spent 15 years building something that could survive, and surviving and thriving were not the same thing, and he was interested in the latter. He told them that Isla was his partner, not in the organizational sense only, in the fullest sense, that she would be present in the business decisions, in the structural decisions, in any room where decisions were made, and that her word carried the same weight as his. 30 faces. He read them the way he read everything, not looking for approval, not needing the room's validation, but reading for the structural responses, for who was with this and who wasn't, and who needed more time to decide. A man named Galloway, who had run the South Side operations for 7 years and had strong opinions about how things should be, stood up from his chair. He was 61, broad through the chest, and he looked at Rhett with an expression that was not quite hostility, but occupied the same neighborhood. "You're asking us to follow a woman we don't know," Galloway said, "into a transition that will cost us significantly. On your word." "No," Rhett said. "I'm telling you what's happening. You're free to respond however you like." "That's the kind of answer that sounds like respect and means something else," Galloway said. "What it means," Rhett said, "is that I've run this organization for 15 years, and the people in this room have done well by it. I'm offering continuity of that. What changes is the structure and the person beside me. What doesn't change is that I keep my commitments." He held Galloway's gaze. "If you're in, you're in. If you're not, tell me now and we arrange an exit that's clean for everyone." Galloway looked at Isla. She looked back at him, level and unhurried, and she said nothing because she didn't need to, because the steadiness of her gaze said the thing that words would have cheapened. Galloway sat down. 3 people left the organization in the following week. Clean exits, arranged without drama or retribution, the way Rhett had promised. The other 27 stayed, and the transition began, and the city continued to turn on its axis the way it always had, indifferent to the internal reorganizations of the people who thought they ran parts of it. The last thing that happened was small. 6 months after the waterfront, on a morning in October when the city was cold again and the garden had gone to the bare, clean lines of late autumn, Isla found a manila envelope on the kitchen counter. Her name on the front, handwritten, which was unusual enough that she picked it up and turned it over before opening it. Inside, property documents. Transfer documents for the estate, the 3 primary businesses, the financial accounts. Every significant asset transferred into joint names, his and hers. No conditions. No reversals written in. No escape routes. She stood at the kitchen counter for a while, in the morning quiet before the house woke up properly, with the documents in her hands and the garden outside going silver in the early light. Rhett came downstairs at 7:15. She was still standing there. He saw the envelope in her hands and he poured his coffee, and he came to stand beside her and he looked at the documents the same way she was looking at them, as if they were a new thing in the world worth examining. "This is a lot," she said. "Yes," he said. "You could have told me." "I wanted you to see it first," he said, "before we talked about it. So the first moment was just the thing itself." She looked at the documents for another moment. Then she set them on the counter and she looked at him, and the morning light was the same light it had always been, and the coffee was the right temperature, and outside a bird she didn't recognize was making a sound in the garden that she made a note to look up later. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I know," he said. "Then why?" "Because you should know it too," he said, "in writing, in a way that doesn't depend on my word alone or your trust alone, in a way that holds even if everything else goes wrong." He looked at her directly. "I've spent 15 years building things that could survive without me. I want to spend the next 15 building something that doesn't have to." She breathed through it, carefully. Not the ribs anymore. Those had been healed for months. Just the breath of someone sitting inside a moment that is larger than they expected. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. The garden was bare and cold and exact, and the city ran on beyond the wall, and the morning held everything it was going to hold for the two of them, which was considerable. And the woman who had come through his door, beaten and furious and too proud to ask for help, stood in the kitchen. She knew better than she knew most things, and looked at the man who had come to find her in the rain, and understood, with a completeness that required no performance and no proclamation, that the running was over. Not because she'd been caught, because she'd arrived. The bird in the garden made its sound again. She was going to look it up. She was going to be here tomorrow to look it up. She was going to be here the day after that and the day after that, and that fact settled inside her the way true things settle. Not with drama, not with the weight of significance, but with the quiet, durable solidity of something that has found the place it was always supposed to occupy. She drank her coffee. He drank his. Outside, Chicago turned toward winter, indifferent and magnificent and entirely itself, the way it had always been, the way it would be long after all of them were gone. And inside the wall, in the warmth of the kitchen, two people who had arrived at each other through the worst possible roads stood side by side in the ordinary morning light, and chose, without fanfare, without escape routes, to stay.